Well, first, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Works?
Yeah.
Apologies that I can't talk in Italian, as I should be able to do, having spent several visits to Italy ever since the early 1950s, but never learned enough more than to buy something in a store or something. I was asked to say a few things about the media and terrorism. I'm often invited to give talks about the media, and I've learned that the easiest way to do it is just to read that morning's newspapers, and there are always many examples that give a lot to talk about. So, for example, this morning in Repubblica, which is the one newspaper I had a chance to look at, the first about 7 pages are devoted mostly to Terry Schiavo and the terrible issues that raises about what George Bush calls the culture of life to which we must be dedicated. And on page 18, at the very bottom in the corner, there's a little item about 10 lines that reports Jean Ziegler's report to the United Nations yesterday about Iraq, with the results that the number of children suffering serious malnutrition, which means brain damage, probably permanent brain damage, has doubled since the invasion. And he also mentions that the report in the British medical journals that the number of deaths, mostly from violence, since the invasion is hundreds of thousands beyond the norm. That's another part of the culture of life. And again, that's on page 18 at the very bottom of the page, if you happen to notice it, which explains the priorities of Western civilization rather well. There's also in the front part of the newspaper a report that it reports the commission that on U.S. intelligence, and mentions that now there's a new director of intelligence appointed, John Negroponte, who was formerly the ambassador to Iraq. It did not mention that Negroponte now has the position of the leading counter-terrorist leader in the world. So he's the head of counter-terrorism. But it did not mention that he's also a leading condemned international terrorist, condemned by the World Court and the Security Council. He was the ambassador to Honduras in the 1980s, where he ran the largest CIA station in the world, not because Honduras is of any great importance, but because his main task was to supervise the military bases in Honduras, where the U.S. terrorist army was being trained and sent to Nicaragua to carry out major terrorist attacks. Their official orders were to attack what are called soft targets, meaning undefended civilian targets, like agricultural collectives and health clinics and so on. And their orders from the U.S. command were to avoid the Nicaraguan army, which they were able to do because the United States had complete control of the airspace over Nicaragua. And these were unusual guerrillas. They had computers and contacts with the Air Force, which could inform them of where the Sandinista army, the Nicaraguan army, was deployed, so they could avoid the army and attack undefended targets. That was the terrorist army that Negroponte was organizing in his Honduran bases with the largest CIA station in the world. If Nicaragua had adopted the principles of Western societies, it would have reacted by carrying out major terrorist attacks within the United States. That would not be preventive war, but defense against actual war. Instead of following Western principles, Nicaragua pursued legal means. It went to the World Court, the International Court of Justice, where it presented a case. The court actually, the U.S. refused to appear, but the court nevertheless took the U.S. position seriously. And part of the U.S. position is interesting. The court refused to, the case was presented by a famous Harvard University law professor, much of his case was thrown out by the court, was not admitted, because when the United States agreed in 1946 to accept World Court jurisdiction, it exempted itself from all multilateral treaties, like the UN Charter, for example. So the U.S. can't be charged with aggression or any other of the major crimes in international treaties, and that part of Nicaragua's case was excluded. The case was restricted to very narrow grounds, bilateral U.S.-Nicaragua treaties and what's called customary international law. Nevertheless, even on these very narrow grounds, the court condemned the United States for international terrorism, ordered them to stop the attack, and to pay very substantial reparations to Nicaragua, reparations which would go far beyond covering the debt that has since been strangling the country. The United States rejected the court judgment, and with the support of its Western allies, escalated the war against Nicaragua. Of course, refused to pay any reparations. Nicaragua then continued to pursue the procedures required by international law. It went to the UN Security Council, which passed 2 successive resolutions affirming the court judgment and calling on all states to observe international law. Of course, the United States vetoed the resolutions. Britain politely abstained. Almost nothing was reported, a few words here and there, so no one even knows about it. But that tells us that John Negroponte is one of the world's leading condemned international terrorists. That's what the headline should have said in La Repubblica and every other newspaper on the front page. And the terrorist war against Nicaragua was not a small affair. The number of people killed from the war, if you put it in per capita equivalent terms in the United States, it would be about 2.5 million people killed. That's more than the total number of Americans killed in all wars combined in all of American history. By now, the United States took over again in 1990, and since then the situation in Nicaragua has gotten even worse under neoliberal principles, the usual consequences, and by now 60% of Nicaraguan children under 2 years old are suffering severe malnutrition, probable permanent brain damage. Now, there's a very simple way to overcome this massive problem in Nicaragua. In fact, if there were any conservatives in the West, which there are not, they would follow conservative principles. Very conservative principles are to pay the debts that you are ordered to pay by the courts. So if there were anyone who believed in the culture of life, they would not worry about a poor woman who's denied the right to die in peace, but they would worry about 60% of young Nicaraguan children who are going to suffer probable permanent brain damage because of U.S. terrorist war, and its refusal to pay what it was ordered to pay by the courts, which could overcome easily the problem of malnutrition, anemia, and brain damage. So returning to the media, there's a very simple experiment that you can carry out to determine whether anyone in the Italian media, or for that matter, the Western media, cares in the least about the culture of life, about people who are suffering severe brain damage, and who could be cured, not a woman who's dying and is being kept alive for political purposes, but children who are the victims of massive international terrorism, for which the United States was condemned, and for which one of the leading directors of it has now been appointed head of the world's leading head of counterterrorism. The results of this experiment are obvious. You don't have to carry it out. And the conclusion is that in Western culture, whether it's Italy or England or the United States, concern over terrorism is zero. Concern over the culture of life is negative. If you look further in the newspaper, you find a little item which announces that the State Department in the United States released its annual list of states that support terror and are a threat to the United States. The list is the usual list, but there are two states that are particularly interesting, and if there were any media at all in the West that cared about issues like terrorism and violence and atrocities, the headline would be focusing on those two states, that's Cuba and Syria. How did Cuba get on the list of terrorist states? Well, that happened in 1982. There was a list of states supporting terrorism, but they had to remove one of them because the United States was going to provide it with military aid and means to develop weapons of mass destruction. That was Iraq, Saddam Hussein. The gentleman who was in charge of conveying that offer was Donald Rumsfeld, now Secretary of Defense, who went to Iraq and shook hands with his friend Saddam Hussein and arranged for the dispatch of aid, including military aid. Britain did the same, so did other states. That aid, incidentally, continued long after Saddam's worst atrocities, the gassing of the Kurds and so on, and long after the war with Iran was over. That was not the reason for the aid. It was to benefit, as the administration said, it was to benefit U.S. exporters, and because Saddam was helping maintain stability and human rights in the region. When Iraq was dropped from the list of states supporting terrorism, that left an opening, and somebody else had to be brought in. So Cuba was added to the states supporting terrorism, which makes good sense. Cuba has a lot of credentials in international terrorism. It is the target of more international terrorism than the rest of the world combined. That began right after Cuba had Castro had overthrown Batista. The Kennedy administration right away started a major terrorist campaign against Cuba. The goal of it was run by Robert Kennedy, the Senate president's brother, and his goal was, I'm quoting now, to bring the terrors of the earth to Cuba. The United States is a very free country, in fact, the most free in the world. That's true. And we have more information about government policies than any other country in the world. And from the declassified record, the record of internal documents that have been made open, we now know the reasons for the attack, for the terrorist attack against Cuba. The main reason was what was called Cuba's successful defiance. Here's the words. The very existence of the Castro regime is successful defiance of U.S. policies going back to the Monroe Doctrine, 1820. Nothing to do with the Russians. 1820, the Monroe Doctrine.
Oh, okay.
It's nothing to do with the Russians. So therefore, Cuba had to be attacked, given the terrors of the earth. This was Robert Kennedy, who was in charge, assigned that task to the CIA as its highest priority. That was a major factor that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which came very close to a terminal nuclear war. As soon as the crisis was over, Kennedy escalated the terrorist war again against Cuba, and that continued, and the peak period was in the late 1970s. That included the shooting down of the bombing of the Cubana airliner with about 80 people killed and many other terrorist atrocities. So it made good sense to add Cuba to the list of terrorist states in 1982, right after this peaking of the terrorist atrocities. The two men charged with blowing up the Cubana airliner, who were imprisoned in Venezuela but then somehow miraculously escaped, Orlando Bosch and Posada Carriles, continued with their terrorist activities. Posada was sent to El Salvador, where he was in charge of helping to organize the terrorist war that the United States was carrying out in Central America. Orlando Bosch came to Florida. The U.S. Justice Department and the FBI charged him with 30 terrorist acts, many carried out in the United States, and wanted to deport him from the country as a dangerous international terrorist. President George Bush, number one, overruled the Justice Department and the FBI and granted him a presidential pardon, and he's now living happily in Florida, taking part in organizing other terrorist acts against Cuba. There is something called the Bush Doctrine, that's Bush number 2, and its major element is, quoting, that any state that provides a haven for terrorists is a terrorist state and must be treated accordingly by bombing and invasion. So therefore, if some of you want to bomb the United States, if you're ever brought to trial, you can just appeal to the Bush Doctrine. It's one of many examples. Let me just turn for a minute to Syria, which is also interesting. Syria is one of the main supporters of the U.S. so-called war on terrorism. Syria is very much opposed to the Islamic terrorist groups. It has actually penetrated them, which U.S. intelligence can't do, and it provides very valuable intelligence to the United States on Islamic jihadi-style terrorism. But like Cuba or Serbia, Syria is guilty of successful defiance of U.S. policies. That makes it a state supporting terror by definition. We can tell exactly how seriously the United States understands this by going back 10 years to the Clinton administration. Clinton offered to remove Syria from the list of states supporting terror if it agreed to U.S.-Israeli demands for settling the Israeli-conquered territories in the Golan Heights. Syria insisted on retaining its own territory that had been conquered by Israel, and therefore it remained on the list of states supporting terror. Well, these are typical examples from this morning's newspaper, and these are the things that would be reported right on the front page if the media were concerned with telling the truth about the real world instead of protecting power. And you can be sure that tomorrow you'll find further examples of the primary commitment to supporting power and reshaping events of the world so that they fit that demand. So I just suggest that as an experiment for tomorrow.
During his last journey to Brussels, George Bush II has said about Iran that one cannot leave any option while defending the safety of the free nations. Do you feel that new bombs are about to be dropped?
Well, just a word of background. Iran, probably more than any state in the world, has a right to develop a potential nuclear option. It's surrounded by nuclear-armed states. Most of it is surrounded by the United States, the global superpower, which has a doctrine of first use of nuclear weapons. Israel is the major regional power, has hundreds of nuclear weapons. Pakistan is nuclear armed. It's completely surrounded by hostile nuclear armed powers. So therefore it has a right to enrich uranium under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's granted that right to enrich uranium, which would leave it with the potential ability to develop a nuclear deterrent. And the United States has no opposition to that. In fact, in the case of Iran, the United States supported the development of the nuclear reactors by the Shah, because he was an ally of the United States, and he had no need for any kind of deterrent. They were just trying to develop the potential for nuclear energy and possibly a nuclear weapon, and the U.S. always supported that. So we now have the curious situation of Iran carrying out activities which are permitted under international treaties, which the U.S. is violating by developing new nuclear weapons, and in a situation where the U.S. now, Iran now has justification for developing the potential for a nuclear deterrent. It did not have that excuse when the U.S. was supporting uranium enrichment. But to get to your question, I doubt that the U.S. is planning to bomb Iran or to have Israel bomb Iran. If that were the intention, they probably wouldn't have been announcing it so openly for the last few years. I mean, if you're planning to bomb a country, you don't announce very loudly for year after year, I'm going to bomb you, so you'd better disperse your facilities and create defenses. And the threats have been very overt. And although I don't read the Italian press, I'm willing to make a bet that they were never reported in Italy. Last year, the United States sent to Israel 100 of its most advanced jet bombers, announced as capable of bombing Iran. Israel already has an air force that is larger and more technologically advanced than any NATO country outside the United States. And this additional 100 jet bombers are publicly announced, though not reported, as capable of bombing Iran. Well, Iranian intelligence hears that. They're also providing these jet bombers with what are called special weapons. Nobody knows what that means, but Iranian intelligence is intended to make the worst case judgment. And there have been many other similar announcements of an intention to attack Iran. So what is the purpose? My guess is that there are two purposes. One is to provoke the Iranian leadership into becoming more repressive internally, which will contribute to efforts to subvert Iran, to break it up from within. And probably the other purpose is to intimidate Europeans. The second purpose has been achieved. So major European corporations, big ones like British Petroleum, Krupp Thyssen in Germany, have withdrawn their investments in Iran. The United States has also pressured Japan to back away from developing a large oil field in Iran. The one country that the United States cannot intimidate is China. So unlike Europe, China is continuing its commercial relations and development projects in Iran. My suspicion is, we don't know for certain, that these are the primary motives for all of the saber-rattling, the threats against Iran. I think the United States is very unlikely to attack Iran or any other country if it's capable of defending itself. They attacked Iraq because they knew perfectly well that Iraq was the weakest country in the region and had no possible means of self-defense after 10 years of sanctions that had killed hundreds of thousands of people and practically destroyed the country. One lesson that the invasion of Iraq taught the entire world is you'd better develop defenses, nuclear weapons and others, to defend yourself against the United States. First of all, we should remember that the phrase war against terror is pure propaganda. The United States itself is one of the leading terrorist states. And in fact, the war on terror was declared in 1981 by the Reagan administration, and it was the prelude to the huge U.S. terrorist wars in Central America. And anyone who knows any history will know that when a country declares a war against terror, it's probably planning to carry out massive terrorism. And that was a typical example. Through the 1980s, the United States was the population was constantly frightened by repeated threats of terror, all fabricated. So in 1981, there was a big scare story by the government and the media about Libyan assassins who were wandering the streets of Washington planning to murder our cowboy leader who was hiding in the White House surrounded by tanks. That was part of the background for the bombing of Libya later years. In 1983, there was great fear of a Russian air base that was being built to attack the United States on the island of Grenada, if the Russians had been able to locate it on a map. And that was the background for the invasion of Grenada. So we were saved by a miracle. Shortly after that, the United States was under attack by Nicaragua. President Reagan declared a state of national emergency in the United States because the Nicaraguan army was only 2 days away from Texas. And that was part of the background for the attack on Nicaragua. And so it continued. In 1989, there was huge hysteria developed. It was the main story in the media about Hispanic narco-traffickers who were going to destroy the United States. That was the background for the invasion of Panama, and so it continued. In 2002, when Bush announced the invasion of Iraq, The story was that Iraq is developing weapons of mass destruction, which it's going to use to attack the United States, and it's working together with Al-Qaeda to carry out further terrorist attacks like September 11th. And about half the population in the United States still believes that, even though it's been officially discounted by the government. The government's recognized it's not true, but the government media propaganda system is strong enough so that about half the population still believes it. In fact, a large part of the population, probably a majority, thinks that Europe supported the war in Iraq, like Berlusconi. There's a very good reason for all of this. The population has to be frightened for a very simple reason. The population of the United States has been under attack for 25 years. The last 25 years are a unique period in American history. It's the first time in American history that real wages, the actual amount of money you bring home, have stagnated or declined for the majority of the population. Work hours are going up. It's the highest in the industrial world. There are very low benefits, and people are deeply in debt. They really are under attack, and people will accept that only if they're frightened. That's also the reason for the hysteria that was whipped up by the government and the media over the Terry Schiavo case. I mean, it's very important for the government and the corporate system, the business world, to make sure that people don't pay attention to what's being done to them, but pay attention to something else. I've been in Europe for about 10 days, and I've been traveling, and it's been interesting to see how subordinated European media and intellectuals are to U.S. propaganda. So since the President of the United States declares that this poor woman's fate is the major issue in the world, European media are inundated with discussion of this fabrication. And it's pure political cynicism, an effort to divert the population of the United States away from what's actually happening to them. Yeah. Are the American journalists threatened?
No, the director of CNN in the Pacific declared 12 American.
Yeah, where is it? Yeah. Are they under attack?
They were killed by Americans.
I don't think it's a plan to kill journalists. It's just that amazingly, this is one of the most amazing events in military history. This should have been the easiest military occupation in history. The country was destroyed. There's no support, outside support for resistance. There's an overwhelming military power there. It has all the resources to rebuild the country. I mean, it should have been over in a week. But somehow, out of a combination of arrogance, ignorance, and incompetence, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, and the rest succeeded in creating a military catastrophe. I mean, the United States is having much more trouble in Iraq than Germany had in occupied Europe. And Germany was at war, and the partisans were supported from the outside. The result is that the journalists, almost all of them, and the diplomats, and the aid officials, and everyone else, live under very heavy protections. You can't go anywhere unless you're followed by an Abrams tank and you're in a vehicle with military protection. And the soldiers are very frightened. They don't know who's going to shoot at them next or where the next bomb's going to come from. So the result is that their orders are to shoot at anything. And so they do kill journalists. But it's not planned. The only way that the military can protect itself is like in Fallujah. where first you bomb for a month and drive out hundreds of thousands of people, and then you go in and you turn it into Grozny. That works. But otherwise, they just are under orders to shoot anything. And I think the journalists, including the Italian journalists, are just accidental victims of this policy.
I must say that I am quite struck of the courage you have in speaking so openly. Because sometimes when you speak this way, I feel afraid myself. So my question from one side is, are you afraid? One question. The other one is, I'm sorry. The other question is there a movement together with you? I imagine you're not alone saying these things. And how do you connect? And in other words, is it possible to do something? Because on one side, the other feeling besides the fear is impotence. Because it seems that all the communication system is so terribly organized and manipulative. I don't know what to say about anyhow. So I'd like to know something, your point about that. Thank you.
I'll tell you some personal incidents. Recently I was in Colombia, which is the worst human rights violator in the world, in the hemisphere, Western Hemisphere, and also the leading recipient of U.S. military aid that goes along together. I have friends in Colombia who I traveled with, professors, priests, human rights activists, and others, who really have a right to be afraid. I mean, they face the threat of assassination constantly. For the last few months, we've had a visitor from Colombia, a labor leader, who escaped after the fourth assassination attempt, and he just went back. They don't talk about being afraid. You know, they just go on with their work. And that's the same all over the world. I've seen it everywhere. I mean, people like us are the safest people in the world. We don't have any right to talk about being repressed. I mean, I've had death threats for 40 years and bomb threats and, police protecting the office and all sorts of other things. When I give talks, there's often police protection and so on. But, these things are so minor as compared with what goes on in the rest of the world that we really don't even have any right to talk about. I mean, I've been in prison a number of times, and I've faced a long jail sentence, which just was stopped because the Tet Offensive ended the trials. But that wasn't repression. I was involved in open resistance. And yes, that's what comes from it. And as far as support is concerned, I mean, American public opinion is very different from what you read about. Very different. So my own views are almost, I wouldn't say they're in the mainstream, but they're very acceptable to a very large part of the public, probably a majority. So the media are very careful not to report this. But if you look at American public attitudes, it's about the same as Europe. So a large majority of the population wants to cut military spending, increase social spending, health, and so on. Large majorities support the Kyoto Protocol. In fact, the majority of Bush voters think that he supported it. Large majority supports the International Criminal Court, and so it goes over issue after issue. I mean, government and media and intellectuals are in one corner, and the public is almost completely different on just about every issue, which is why it never gets reported. So I and anyone else who's available can't respond to a tiny fraction of the requests to travel and give talks and discussions and meetings, usually for thousands of people. So there's no isolation. It's important to bear in mind that the impression that people have of the United States, including people who live there, is what's filtered through the propaganda system. And that's very different from the reality, just like everywhere else in the world. So for example, just to give one example, you've all heard that George Bush won the election because of people's concern for moral values. But what isn't told you is what are those moral values? Here's what they are. The highest one is that people feel that the society is too materialistic, too committed to consumerism and so on. A large majority of the population think it's a moral issue for the government to guarantee health care to everyone. I mean, those are the moral issues. And both political parties and the media and the intellectual class are completely different. They will never mention any of these things. What they want you to believe is that the moral issues are whether Terry Schiavo ought to have a feeding tube.
Mr. Chomsky, up here. Two little questions. First of all, how do you see the United Nations, and how do you think will be the future of the United Nations? And the other thing, how do you see Michael Moore movies and books?
The easiest question is Michael Moore. I think he's making an interesting contribution. And it's very interesting to me to see the reaction to it. So I happened to be in England when Michael Moore won the prize in Cannes, the movie documentary prize. And I was reading the commentary in England on Michael Moore, which was quite interesting. In one of what's called one of the more left newspapers, The Independent, there was a long interview with Michael Moore, a very critical interview in which the interviewer claimed that Michael Moore is a liar. And the reason was that Michael Moore claimed that he came from a working class background, but his father owned a home and had a car. His father was an auto worker, but he claimed he came from a working class background. And that reflects the fact that the notion of class has been eliminated from the intellectual culture. You're not allowed to think about class. It's too dangerous, that people might pursue their class interests. But that's England, not the United States. I should say that I have a daughter who teaches history at a state college which is mostly poor people from the inner city, so adults coming back. The first day of class, she often asks people to identify their class. What class are you from? What social class are you from? And she gets two answers. Either they're middle class or they're underclass. Those are the only two classes. If your father has a job as a janitor, you're middle class. If your father's in jail, you're underclass. These are real successes of indoctrination, much more than false beliefs about weapons of mass destruction. Turning to the United Nations, the future of the United Nations depends on whether Western societies can become democracies. I mean, you can tell me about the relation between public opinion and public policy in Italy. In the United States, a large majority, overwhelming majority of the population supports the United Nations, wants the United States to budget to give more funding to the United Nations, wants the United Nations to take the lead in international crises, not the United States. And a majority even is in favor of giving up the U.S. veto in the Security Council. So the U.S. would then follow majority rule. Now this is, again, totally remote from public policy, the media, and intellectual opinion. So if the United States can become a functioning democracy in which public opinion has some influence on policy, then the future of the United Nations is fairly bright. But there's a huge campaign to prevent that in Italy as well. So take, for example, the last few days, all of the furor about the report on corruption at the United Nations. This is with regard to the oil for food. And take a look at what the charges. There is a good, serious report by Paul Volcker, but that's never recorded. What is reported here too is that maybe one UN official, Sevan, received $160,000 from an aunt in Cyprus, maybe. And maybe Kofi Annan's son took more, $100,000 that he wasn't supposed to get. What isn't reported is that in the oil for food program, there are $17 billion missing. 11 billion of that was authorized by the United States in illegal sales to its allies, Turkey and Jordan. That's 11 billion out of a large part of the rest somehow was smuggled through the Persian Gulf, which is under the complete control of the U.S. Navy, which means it was permitted to leave, of course. The total amount that's not accounted for is $1.7 billion. About a quarter of that went to Kuwait, U.S. ally. And the rest, nobody knows, some accounting error. But what you don't talk about is the maybe $15 billion that the U.S. was ensuring went to its own allies. And what you do talk about is that Benon Sevan may have received $160,000 from his aunt. And the other thing that you don't talk about, that's censored, is that the oil for food program was run by the United States and Britain in a manner which murdered hundreds of thousands of people and destroyed the civilian society. And what you don't read about is that the two directors of the program, Dennis Halliday and Hans Spone, both resigned because they regarded the program as genocidal. And the other thing you don't read about is that under the American occupation of Iraq, $18 billion of Iraqi oil money has somehow disappeared. The main point is that this huge media offensive about corruption at the United Nations, in Italy too, is simply a way of trying to undermine support for the United Nations and to cover up the real crimes, which are in the Western. I'll just finish with one little story about the United States and the United Nations. The population of the United States has always supported the United Nations, still does, quite strongly. In the early days of the United Nations, late 1940s, early 1950s, the United Nations was very popular among elites and the media and intellectuals. The reason was that it was right after the Second World War. Everybody was destroyed. So everyone was following U.S. orders. The Russians were vetoing things at the United Nations because the United Nations was being used as an instrument of the Cold War against Russia. So they kept vetoing resolutions. And there was an academic specialty with leading anthropologists and psychologists and others trying to explain why the Russians are so negative. Why do they keep saying no at the United Nations? And the explanation that was given by the leading scientists was that children are raised in swaddling clothes, and that makes them negative. So they're negative, and then when they get to the United Nations, they say no all the time. I was a radical student at the time, and there was a small number of us who considered this ridiculous. And we used to call it, I don't know if you can translate this, we used to call it diaperology. By the mid-1960s, the United Nations had become much more representative of the world with decolonization. If you look at the record of vetoes since the 1960s, the United States is far in the lead. Britain is second, and nobody else is even close. But there are no great anthropologists and psychologists trying to figure out what's psychologically wrong with the country.
I hope you say that